Hello, and welcome to Books in the World. I'm your host, Kathleen Murphy. Books in the World is an interview show produced by the Cape Cod Writers Center and the Cape Media Center. The Writers Center was established 58 years ago and sponsors a 4-day writers conference every summer on Cape Cod. The goal of Books in the World is to show how writers, illustrators, publishers, editors, and others in the literary field play their roles in the world of books and other communication media. This show has been broadcast continuously since 1978, making it the longest-running program of its kind in the United States. Today, we are delighted to welcome Nancy Rubin Stuart and talk about her latest book, Poor Richard's Women, Deborah Read Franklin and Other Women Behind the Founding Father. So welcome, Nancy.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Nancy is an award-winning author and journalist whose 8 nonfiction books focus on women and social history. Her most recently published works include Defiant Brides, the untold story of 2 Revolutionary-era women and the radical men they married, and The Muse of the Revolution, the secret pen of Mercy Otis Warren and the founding of a nation. A former journalist and writer-producer for Scripps Productions, Stuart has written for the New York Times, Huffington Post, the New England Quarterly, and national magazines. She serves as executive director of the Cape Cod Writers Center. I've read other books by Nancy and have been impressed by how thoroughly she not only researches her subjects, but also by how she successfully weaves this research into a rich and entertaining narrative. After reading this book, Poor Richard's Women, I feel like now I've seen a side of Benjamin Franklin that I could never have imagined. Quoting actual letters between Ben, his wife Deborah, and other women that were clearly dear to him, Nancy's work reveals his passion and his anger, his tenderness and his frustration, and so much more. I also appreciated that Nancy has shown how accomplished these women in Ben's life were. One ran Franklin's successful businesses, another was an acclaimed composer and musician, and another hosted a salon near Paris where she entertained the brightest figures of the Enlightenment. So it gives me great pleasure to speak with Nancy today about her work and about these amazing women. Welcome again, Nancy.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
So one of your motivations for this book was to correct historical misconceptions about Deborah Franklin, who was common law wife to Ben Franklin for over 40 years. So what were these misconceptions, and does history make the same errors with the other women in Ben's life?
Well, I did start the book because I was concerned about Deborah. And I knew that most of the histories up until very recently about history was related to men and written by men and from a male perspective. And Deborah, of course, in history books, where she's mentioned at all, is looked upon as a stupid, provincial, non-essential woman that he married, sort of, by the way, common law marriage, because, well, it was just when he was young and unsuccessful at first. And as I did the research on this, I realized this wasn't true at all. And I said, well, we need to correct this image. This is crazy. And, now, of course, with feminist scholarship, which has been, in the second wave and now in our third wave, is looking at things, looking at all sides of an issue. It's just been verified even more. For instance, the American Philosophical Society has accounts of Deborah's in their ledger books from Ben Franklin of her notes. The letters have been now digitized for the first time. And so they're readily accessible. And you see, yes, she couldn't spell because colonial middle-class women in Philadelphia anyway, they could read and write, but they didn't learn spelling. It wasn't considered important. They knew how to compute enough to maybe manage a household budget. But Deborah was way beyond that. I mean, she probably helped her mother when her mother became widowed, at least with her ointment business and salve business, which became rather prosperous. in due time. But she also then took over the store soon after she moved in with Ben. It was a common law marriage for reasons we cannot discuss now. But she took over his little store, and it was just a stationery shop, and she turned it into a general store, and she imported goods, of course, from the piers in the Delaware River and so on, that came in from the farmlands, and she made this into a very profitable. And then when he became appointed the Philadelphia postmaster, and then later the colonial postmaster, she was his assistant and often took over. In fact, there are many times when he says only she could figure out the transaction between different monies. Of course, monies were not uniform at the time. Plus, there were international currency differences, which she could figure out. And when he left for England the first time, he said to the person who took over the post office, the mail, of course, he said, you've got to listen to Mrs. Franklin, because she's had a great deal of experience there. And even though he doesn't talk a lot about Deborah in his autobiography, he does talk about her being not only a thrifty wife, but a frugal wife, and somebody who really was largely responsible for the monies and so on that he saved. When he was in England, and he was there first for 5 years and then later for 10, she was the one who had to manage many of his affairs, his financial affairs.
And I appreciate that he gives her credit. I know it's a humble thing, but he does seem to give her credit. I think from reading your book, I got the impression that he really never said much bad about her.
No, he never did. He never did. And sometimes he praised her. I mean, there's a very famous poem when he calls her his plain country Jane, and he celebrates her. This was when he was a Mason. He had one of the founders of the Masons in Philadelphia, and he praises her in a long. Now historians have pondered this for a long time. I said, well, this was preserved. It's a long poem in stanzas. Must have been important. He presented it to the Masons, and he celebrates her. She's not beautiful, perhaps, but she's faithful and devoted, and she's really been responsible for so much happiness and so much, prosperity in his life. So it's kind of remarkable. I also have to say that he also, appoints her the power of attorney twice when he's left. Now that's extraordinary for a colonial woman. I mean, that's not what colonial women were, in the home and the hearth. That was it.
Right.
So,
right. When he was traveling abroad, it was not that he trusted the males in his life. One of his sons was a little, So it was a true compliment to her and her skills that he did that.
Yes.
So it's not just Deborah, though. These other women are also incredibly accomplished, and there were misunderstandings about them historically as well, correct?
Yes, I think so. I mean, you're not hearing a lot certainly in history books, sort of a passing glance over them. Even going back to Katie Green, who was a young woman, but very, very smart, and rather later marries would be the future governor of Rhode Island. Katie's very smart, and he immediately takes to her. Well, he takes to her romantically, she takes to him romantically, but aside from that, she was very smart and intelligent, and her letters reveal that too. But then later, the other women, we don't know a lot about Mrs. Stevenson in England, but she was urbane and sophisticated, and at least we don't know a lot. She wasn't a great speller, again, and rather timid about writing those letters. But all the women that he adored, which he did, were all intelligent. His French women, Madame Brion, the famous musician, so famous, Boccherini devoted his 6th piano sonata to her. She was a sort of a pioneer with the piano forte, they called it. This was after the harpsichord. When you read her letters, and there's over 100 sort of love letters to him, but she's very smart, and she talks about the philosophers. She names them the ancient philosophers. She refers to them. She's highly educated. She's very intelligent. She's she makes fun of him too later with his gout. And she writes a thing about the gout, and how this was the enemy of Franklin, and of course because of his poor eating habits or living habits, whatever. But so she's very sophisticated. And then, needless to say, Madame Helvetius, the famous hostess of leading salons in the Enlightenment. Many scientists, intellectuals, philosophers, astronomers, et cetera, all of this, people would come to her estate. She hosted these regularly. She was very sophisticated and very bright. So, and she was the former wife. She was the widow of a philosopher.
Right.
So, we're not dealing with. We're dealing with sort of an upper echelon of women that he's attracted to, and obviously he's brilliant, and obviously he's attracted to very intelligent women.
Right.
Yeah.
And it wasn't, at least with these women that you mentioned, it wasn't like it was a dalliance in the parlance of the time. It wasn't just a touch and go. It was, they continued correspondence, which is why we know about them now, is that they continued correspondence for decades, some of them, right?
Thank goodness they did, so that we know about them.
Right. Right.
If we didn't, we wouldn't know much about them, if at all. The silly rumors, of course, to this day pervade about how he was this lecherous, he had these flocks of women, that he had many illegitimate children, all this stuff, silliness. I don't think that's all exactly accurate by any means, but we do know these women were people that he spent time with and devoted time and energy and thought, and many letters to.
Right. At the same time that he was working as the founding father, he was trying to
at the same time he was working as, not only first in this country, trying to deal with the Penns, and they weren't paying their taxes for the the hostilities on the border, the Pennsylvania-Ohio River border. He's politically active. He's clerk of the assembly, then he becomes a representative of the assembly. At one point, he's speaker of the assembly. So he's very, very busy. He organizes a citizen militia because the Quakers they didn't believe in violent, solutions to problems. So, he does all of that while he's married to Deborah and more. He's already built his media mogul. Becomes a media mogul with his publishing enterprise, which is interstate. It won't be interstate, then it's intercolonial at first, and in those years. So, that's one section of his life. And then later, when he's in England, he's continually negotiating with the Penns and the royal court, and trying to get reason to get them to pay up, and that doesn't happen. And then the second time, after a while, he really becomes the representative of the angry young colonies that want to separate, and he's trying to negotiate with Parliament figures continually to try to calm this thing down and get rid of all of these oppressive acts that the British were instigating in the 1760s. And well into the early 1770s. So all of this, and then later, third part, when he's in France, he's one of the three commissioners at first who are trying to obtain funds from the French to support the American cause, the revolution. Yeah. And he's negotiating with, Vergen, I can't pronounce, I'm not sure how, and the French court, and he goes to Versailles often, and other financial and important people in France, in Paris, right. And he finally becomes the minister plenipotentiary, which is the main minister to obtain these funds. And then still later, he's negotiating for the British treaty later, after the defeat of the British in America. So he's incredibly busy, high energy person, obviously.
Obviously, yeah, he's incredible. And his air baths and his exercise routines and writing these letters, and the amount of money that he raised for the American colonies and then for the United States is, if in today's equivalent, it's billions of dollars. And
yes,
in his life, at the end of his life, he didn't get as much recognition from his contemporaries, not as much as we give him now, after looking at the correspondence and looking at all the activity that he was doing behind the scenes in order to make these things happen. So just really impressive. And then on top of it, to have him be someone that is human, someone that is has emotions, is a loving and caring person, and tender with the letters that he's writing to these people, and really caring about these people that he's interacting with. It's a good book.
Thank you. But that is the point, is that he is perceived in history books and even today. Benjamin Franklin, he made huge inroads in terms of the electricity, scientist, statesman, the lightning rod, the Franklin furnace, bifocals. I mean, it goes on and on, the inventions and the things, and of course he was an astute diary keeper of natural phenomena, whether it was the tides, whether it was the seabirds when he was crossing back and forth across the Atlantic, whether it was nature itself blooming in the spring. The man is, he's a whirlwind.
He never slept, right? He slept like 2 hours a night, right?
He must have, we don't know, but well,
maybe there were two of them.
No, just one. Some people have said he was the most brilliant mind in America, but certainly could very well be. That could be certainly, something one would agree upon. But the point is that he was, you think about Poor Richard's Almanac, from which this title evolved. And Poor Richard's Almanac is filled with these cautionary, early to bed and early to rise, and, thrift. And yes, the honey is sweet, but the bee has a sting. And, it's reason before, emotion. And this is our view of this as a sage, always in control, totally regulated by rationale. And that's the image we have of him. And, it's on the $100 bill, and, it's all that. But
I will say, though, he said all of that, and he was incredibly reasonable, right? And then he went to France. Right?
Well,
because
yes and no.
You mentioned that he got a new wardrobe. He was hobnobbing with these elite people in France, and he knew he had a job to do. So he kind of raised the level. And I think that he was happy to be a little decadent when he was in France, correct?
Well, yes. And of course, Madame Brionne takes him to task for his poor habits after a while. She says, you used to walk, you used to exercise all the time. Now you just sit and play chess or whatever you're doing, go to carriage rides, you don't walk. And no wonder you have, and you're not eating properly, you're eating too much. And no wonder you have gout, and, all this. But
is that one of the things that surprised you about it? That these women were not only dear to him, but also they were happy to just, put him in line if he needed to.
They did.
Was that a surprise?
Yeah. Madame Helvetius, one time he's complaining about a sore shoulder. And she says, what did you do to that shoulder? You're sitting under somebody's window with a guitar trying to court them. She doesn't let him get away. They don't let him get away with anything. But that, so the image nevertheless is one of this really, this sage, this perfect human being. And as I researched the book, that was the amazing thing, is this is not a perfect human being. This person had lots of passion. In fact, passion often overruled his prudence. Yeah. And especially when you see some of the things he says and does with his women. And it changed the image of him and made him much more human rather than this icon, this preserve of restraint.
Right. I love that. I just love that. And I love that you were able to reveal that through his own words and the women's own words, right?
Well, that's the best. You can do it through their words, which I love, to see him through their words.
Right. So, right. Exactly. Yeah. It's wonderful. Really wonderful.
Through their voices.
So like many of her contemporaries, Deborah Franklin's education did not include tutelage in writing. She could write, she could form letters, but she didn't know spelling and syntax and things like that, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I think you hinted that it was similar for Margaret, but what about the French women? And did they correspond in French, or did they, English, or what happened? How did that work?
It was in French, and their writing was, I think, perfect. They were highly educated. French elite women were well educated. Right. And of course, being European, that was very different than provincial colonial America in terms of what was offered and expected. So yes, as far as I know now, Margaret, though, in England, she could read and write, and she was quite sophisticated, much more so than Deborah in terms of she would go to concerts. She was in London. She was concerts and lectures and dinner parties and whatnot. but she was still a woman, and women had a certain place. And she was very shy about her writing. And often she would hand over her messages to her daughter, Polly, and have Polly transcribe what she said, or indicate what she said, so that she stopped writing. But there are some revealing little snippets that Margaret does. At one point, she writes to, well, Ben was in a fury because his daughter Sally was in love with this pauper Englishman, but Deborah had declared her independence on this, because Deborah was the one at home with Sally for all these years, and Deborah, wasn't going to stand in the way of the marriage. And so anyway, Ben was very upset, and he didn't want to have this Richard Beige marry Sally, and so Margaret, meanwhile, in England, is all excited because she's going to send English finery and all these clothes and bridal trousseaux and everything else to Sally. And Ben has a tantrum about it and leaves for France. And so Margaret and Mrs. Stevenson writes really a fascinating letter to Deborah saying, I feel sorry that, he doesn't want any part of this. And I know it's hard for you because you just want him to come home. I mean, it's a very revealing letter. So there's a lot of heart in it. And again, an intelligent woman. It was almost like the wife of a divorced person and his girlfriend talking, to each other in 21st century parlance. Really interesting. Yeah,
it is. It is. It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
I am struck by how tender these words are, as you just said. And I just think, how much did the delay in the delivery of these letters? I mean, letters are lost. They take weeks, maybe sometimes months to arrive. That has to have been a factor in the relationship between himself and all of his correspondence, but especially when it was so emotional, these women.
Yes, well, especially with Deborah, of course, because first he was away for 5 years. It was only supposed to be a few months. And then he was away for 10 years. Again, it was only supposed to be a short time. Became involved in Parliament and the American Revolution, the beginning of it. So, and a lot of letters, we don't know where the first 5 years of Deborah's letters are. They're gone. We don't know whether he threw them out, whether they got lost at sea. We don't know whether his grandson, who took over his estate and his letters later, who was not the most reliable human being in the world. We don't know what happened to them, but they're gone. So we don't have that, but we do have his, in which sometimes he complains he hadn't heard from her, or he sometimes writes and says, yes, I have your letters. And he lists that she's actually written every week. He lists all the dates. But of course we don't have them but for that period of time. But yeah, delays in what was happening and reactions, emotional reactions. Right. And now, for instance, when Deborah at the end of her life becomes ill with strokes, and then finally in the last, 8 months, 10 months, 10 months, almost a year, she doesn't write anymore. And he keeps writing to her because he kept telling her for years he was coming home the next few months, but he never did. And she's longing for it. But then she stops writing, and he says, he keeps writing to her. He says, are you angry with me? Are you upset that I haven't come home? Why haven't I heard from you in so many months? And of course, she was failing. She dies in December of 1744. So there's a lot of, it adds to the drama and suspense. And you can imagine what this must have been like for people. Right. That they don't have answers. And some letters were lost, so that questions that might have been asked, maybe we never knew the answers, or the questions disappeared themselves and we never, so there's a lot of blanks that are there, which is, its own detective story. Right.
How much we learn from that in this day and age when everything is instantaneous, what
immediate,
would it be like for us to just have it all shut down,
Right.
Quite frightening. So you've written about many famous women like Isabella of Castile, Mercy Otis Warren, Marjorie Merriweather Post. The women in Ben Franklin's life were not as famous, although some were within their own sphere of influence. But how did you research this book? How did you, the information that you got on them was not as readily available, but it sounds like you tapped into some really strong resources.
Well, I was fortunate. First of all, the Franklin Papers, which started over 50 years ago at Yale in cooperation with American Philosophical Society, that's a project that's gone on, and that has been the slow transcription of all these. Well, Franklin wrote over almost 30,000 letters, if you can imagine. But and none of them are short, by the way. Very few of them are short. But anyway, that transcription's been going on, and there are many, many bound volumes that one can get in the library. It would take you forever to sift through them and get to the ones about Deborah and the other women. But anyway, that's going on, and that was helpful. I mean, I started this book a long time ago, 25 years ago, and then gave it up several times. Nobody wanted to know about Deborah. I didn't care about her at that time, but I know.
Deborah, we don't want to lose her.
No, but they did. Then fortunately, and so I'm, plodding along with this, and I keep putting it in the back file and giving up on it. But eventually, I think in 2006, the Library of Congress began digitizing the letters. Now, I didn't know about that at the time, but when I started to think about this proposal again, about 7 years ago, then soon I thought I would go back through all the volumes somehow, but then I realized the Library of Congress had digitized most of them. There's still some volumes that have been published that aren't on the Library of Congress website, but most of them were there. Yeah. And it's still a huge job to sift through and buy, because they're done by year and date and so on. But I was very fortunate that I was able to do that. And of course, many, many books also I've collected or read, or parts of them I've read about Ben Franklin. And so that was another obvious help for it.
You have a 4-page bibliography.
Yes, it's rather lovely.
And it's well indexed. It's a really good book for people that want to read it cover to cover, but also if they just want to pick up subjects, about specific people, because your index is great and so on. So
thank you.
It's really well done.
Yeah,
so I have to ask, we're going to have to close. How do we get in touch with you? How do we follow your work? You have a website?
Yes, I do. NancyRubinStuart.com.
Good.
That's my name.
That's pretty easy, and we'll put it on our screen. So wonderful.
Great.
So I really appreciate you talking with me about this. I wish we had more time, but we're going to have to go and leave it at that. So I definitely recommend this book.
Thank you all. It was really fun. Appreciated it. Great interview with you.
Thank you. So if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more, you'll find links to them through our website, capecodwriterscenter.org, through our Facebook page, and on YouTube. Thank you for watching Books in the World.